Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm TX141, but you may call me Paul. Welcome you all to a brand new Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the Mitsubishi A6M5 Otsu Reisen, a Japanese naval fighter coming into Tier 3 and a battle rating of 4.7. Having already provided a historical overview in general for the A6M5 Reisen, our historical background today will consider the development of the A6M5 up to the second subvariant, the A6M5B or the Otsu. We commence in the latter half of 1943, with the A6M5 base variant entering combat for the first time and going up against the F6F-3 Hellcat. The initial engagements led to a number of Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force pilots demanding more from the A6M5 so it could outperform and match up to the F6F. A number of subvariants would therefore be derived in order to accomplish this. The first was the A6M5 Co, a stopgap due to the fact the Mitsubishi Bureau were already overstretched in terms of coming up with new fighter designs while simultaneously continuing their production of the Zero aircraft. The Co differed from the base A6M5 through a couple of minor modifications. Firstly, the thickening of the wing skinning in order to boost the A6M5's dive speed from 660 km an hour to 740 km an hour, and the second one was the fact that the two drum-fed Type 99-2 Model 320mm cannons in the wings were switched to a pair of Type 99-2 Model 4 cannon. The belt-feeding nature of these new cannon meant that 125 rounds per cannon could be stored rather than 100. The first Co model aircraft was to leave the factory in March 1944, and the Co was to be produced up to approximately the summer of 1944. The second subvariant, which you see on your screen right now, was the Otsu, or the A6M5B. The key changes from the Co, and it continued with the modifications from the Co as well, were as follows. The removal of the starboard Type 97 7.7mm machine gun, and replacing it with a Browning-derived 13.2mm Type 3 machine gun, with 240 rounds for the machine gun. The other 7.7mm machine gun in the nose was still retained, with 500 rounds. There was also the addition of a 2-inch or 50mm thick armoured windscreen in order to help protect pilots from head-on attacks, which was a tactic favoured by American pilots. The Otsu then was produced from April to October of 1944, with the intention of helping to turn the tide in the next large-scale aerial engagement of the Battle of the Pacific, and this was to be the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Conversely, quite the opposite turned out, with American pilots dubbing the aerial battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the Otsu was to be retired as of September 1944, being succeeded by the Hay variant of the A6M5 Reisen. And with our historical overview concluded, let us see how the A6M5 Otsu handles in War Thunder. For today's gameplay, we're on the airfield domination map Zhengzhou using the following setup. Omni-purpose belts are our 7.7mm machine gun. The reasoning here is that whilst the 7.7 lacks the overall damage potential as the rest of our armament, we can use it as a corrective tool. What do we mean by this? Well, in those close range engagements when you're trying to get a shot onto an opponent, they may be a little bit more evasive than you expected. Alternatively, your accuracy may be a little bit off. And you can use the omni-purpose belts of the 7.7 to bring your fire back onto target. How so? Well, the first round within the belt is a tracer round, and the fourth round is an adjustment incendiary. These two rounds enable you to achieve this corrective tool effect, with the tracer being a bright yellow flare that travels from your plane to your opponent's or close to your opponent's, and when it strikes your opponent, you know you are making your mark. The adjustment incendiary works slightly differently, not having a tracer, but instead when it hits an opponent it will spark a little bit brighter than say the tracer or the armour piercing rounds within your universal or omni-purpose belts. And this means you can see when you're making your mark and you can bring the rest of your guns into play. The other two rounds within the omni-purpose belts are armour piercing rounds, whereby these rounds are very good at close range at penetrating through canopy glass and potentially achieving a pilot kill or a gunner kill if you're attacking an enemy bomber. For the 13.2mm heavy machine gun, we're using the stealth belts. The first two rounds are armour piercing incendiary rounds, whereby these rounds have the ability to penetrate through enemy fuel tanks and then set them on fire. The third and final round is an intermediate adjustment incendiary round, the incendiary component having a similar effect to the incendiary component of the armour piercing incendiary round, but also you have to consider that as these rounds are intermediate adjustment incendiary rounds, they act in the same way as the AI rounds on the 7.7mm machine gun, sparking quite significantly on your opponent and enabling you to see when you are making your mark. And this is where you can bring your 20mm cannons into play. And for these we are using the stealth belts, with 3 of the 5 rounds being high explosive fragmentation rounds in nature, and these rounds are very good against bomber and fighter alike at cutting fuselage pieces off and splitting planes into 2 or more pieces. For the armour piercing incendiary rounds, there are 2 within these belts, and these rounds are very effective at carrying on in a similar vein to that of the armour piercing incendiary rounds to the 13.2mm machine gun, whereby if they are instant on fuel tanks or indeed the engine of an opponent, they are very good at setting the opponent on fire and causing them to burn to death. To bring this all together, we have a 400m gun convergence, reason being that whilst our playstyle will predominantly be turn fighting or indeed stall fighting, where we cause our opponent to level out below us and then we cut down on top of them, as our opponents have significantly more powerful engines for our battle rating of 4.7, it is highly unlikely that by the time we get guns on our opponent, we will be within a distance of say 250 metres. Instead, we will usually encounter distances of engagement of 300 to 500 metres, and a 400m gun convergence will compensate for this. We also have a standardised 30-minute fuel load to ensure that we can make it to the end of the game unscathed in terms of fuel capacity. And our initial engagement was a head-on pass for a Yakovlev Yak-9P, and unfortunately we bowed out of that at the last minute because we do not want to get hit by at least 3 20mm cannons, if not a significantly more powerful armament in the nose of say 2 20mm cannons and a 37mm. As whilst we do have armoured glass, which is 50mm thick on our plane, we do not have the ability to absorb cannon fire by comparison with say the Yak-9P's potential. We are still very fragile by comparison with the rest of the Zeros in the Japanese historical tree, and this means that we cannot afford to get hit where possible, as even the slightest of cannon hits on our plane will cause our plane to usually lose a control surface and the plane will recoil significantly under the effects of the round impacting. And this is something to be aware of, especially in a head-on engagement, where you try to snap rail out of the way and take a hit. It may cause your plane to roll in the opposite direction temporarily due to the sheer force on the aircraft. At this point we outclimb a Focke-Wulf 190 A4 coming out of their spawn and cause them to stall out. We're using our standardised stall fighting tactics here to cause the A4 to hang in mid-air, and we achieve a critical hit on their tail section and their central gear leg before cutting them to pieces for our first kill. It's at this point that we level out and try to pull distance on a Messerschmitt 109 G6 and a Yakovlev Yak-3P. Both planes have just come out of the enemy spawn and are heading our way. This may be because of the threat we pose up at higher altitudes and the fact they are trying to go for altitude dominance, something which personally I would not recommend letting an A6M5 Otsu achieve, simply because this plane does not have the best of climb rates by comparison with its battle rating contemporaries. To qualify this, the A6M5 Otsu's climb rate is rather good. It can climb with a good number of its battle rating contemporaries, such as the Spitfire Mark 5C at a battle rating of 5.3, and indeed the earlier Focke-Wulf 190 A5, by comparison with the AH you may see, or indeed the Focke-Wulf 190 D9, and the list can go on to some extent, as we go into a head-on engagement with the G6 here, and use our snap rolling capabilities to evade incoming fire, especially that of their 13mm machine guns. At this point we try to break round on the G6, and we unfortunately miss because we do not come around quickly enough, due to a personal error on my part. This means that a G6 can get away, despite the fact we achieve a couple more hits, one on their right flap, and at the same time we now have to consider the Yakovlev Yak-3P encroaching upon our rear. We cannot afford to go after the G6 through fear of the Yak-3 being able to come in behind us and cut us apart with a single burst. But fortunately for us, a friendly Messerschmitt 109 comes onto the tail of the Yak-3P, and at the same time we can afford to go head to head with the Yak-3P and the Messerschmitt 109, I should say, 2 separate friendly 109s getting onto the tail of our adversaries, and at the same time we go into a head-on with the Yak-3P here, snap right out of the way incoming fire that they potentially have, and then try to get a shot onto them. But we can see here how our wider convergence means we do not score a critical hit at a distance of say 150 metres. We do get into firing range, i.e. about 250 to 300 metres, and we may achieve a couple of significant hits, but we decided to hold fire and let our friendly Messerschmitt 109 get the kill because they helped us out. At this point we go for a reload, level out and contemplate our next strategy, which will potentially be to counter any more threats coming out of the spawn point that are trying to cut for altitude. We now return to the concept of the climb rate on the A6M5 Otsu, and for the purposes of this review I am going to avoid comparing this plane to the base A6M5 variant until the very end, in order to make sure this review is impartial to a major extent. The climb rate on the Otsu is decent, however this can only be exploited with distance and time. What do I mean by this? Well, if we take, say for example, a Messerschmitt 19G2 at a battle rating of 5.0 last time I checked. It is a battle rating contemporary, and it can outclimb the A6M5 to higher altitudes rather rapidly over short distances, because the Messerschmitt 19G2 has the engine performance to do so. However, in order to achieve this, it needs a high speed to start the climb, a speed of approximately 375 km/h plus. With the A6M5 Otsu, and this is a characteristic to most of the Zero aircraft, if not all of them, you can initiate a climb at a speed of 275 km/h and continue that climb for a long period of time. Through the appropriate wet staging, you will not have to level out by comparison with your battle rating contemporaries as much to build up speed, and when you do, you only have to have a low threshold of speed in order to continue your climb, not one that extends up into the late 300s. We see again how we can force a Focke-Wulf 190A to stall out below us, and we set them on fire and leave them to burn to death, thanks to most likely our armour-piercing incendiary 20mm cannon rounds, and perhaps those of our 13.2mm machine gun. And by continuing on with our climb rate, we have to realise that in the longer distances as we saw at the start of the game, we can get up to say 4,000, even 5,000 metres altitude in a single climb, through the appropriate wet staging, something which is not as easy in a plane such as a Yakovlev Yak 9, a Messerschmitt 19G, or even say a Focke-Wulf 190 D9. And we can exploit this so long as our opponents do not confront us in the first instance. But you will find in a standard ground strike game, for example, when both teams climb towards each other at the start, that you will have the difficulty of being outclimbed by some of your opponents, and this will mean that you will be in a position where you've got to try and fight upwards, and this is something that the A6M5 Otsu does not do too well in my personal opinion. And as we cause a Yak 9K to stall out below us, we are going to look into why. The difficulty is in the form of the engine. It is the same engine that is carried over from the A6M3, and indeed the base variant of the A6M5, the Nakajima Sake 21 engine. This engine is powerful, and it is powerful for the airframe you are flying, and you are flying a rather light airframe, which means that your climb rate is sustainable, your manoeuvrability is high, all the things you would expect. But the difficulty is in the fact that your acceleration is not too strong, and we can see here how at level flying altitude, that we are picking up our speed gradually, heading towards 400 km/h, but by comparison with a number of planes, even say a Typhoon Mark 1B, late edition, a Spitfire F Mark 9, we are not picking up our speed as rapidly without WEP usage. And this is a key danger and a weakness to the A6M5 Otsu, as we cannot build up our speed quite as rapidly until ideally our opponents hit their thresholds at 500 km/h, and then we reach the same accretion rates for acceleration. We are going to be at a deficit as we dive down on an enemy Spitfire here, and we fortunately cause them to level out a Spitfire F Mark 9, and then we conserve a good portion of our energy to snap round on a Hurricane Mark 1C, the Sea Hurricane. This means we can pick up a clean double kill, and we can see how our energy retention is decent, and how despite the fact we are a turn fighter and our overall control surface is locked up at approximately 465 km/h, we can carry through on targets with a decent degree of accuracy. And coming back to the final point on the engine performance then, we can see in the midst of a dive, even there we do not pick up our speed as rapidly as say a Focke-Wulf 190 D9 or indeed a number of our battle rating contemporaries. The P47D25 for example, whilst it is at a battle rating of 3.0, being a key exaggeration of this fact, we cannot pick up our speed as rapidly as a Thunderbolt in a dive. And this means that we will be left behind, especially if we go up against the likes of an F4U-1C Corsair. As we dive down the P47D25, we now have to qualify what we meant by our consistency of control surfaces in the midst of a high-speed pass. We can see as we knock out that P47D there for what will be our 6th kill, that we do not have the ability to sustain our control surfaces as cleanly above 465 km/h. Our roll rate begins to gradually seize up, but not to an extreme extent by comparison with say the A6M2, if you want a direct comparison, which lost its roll rate quite quickly. Instead, we begin to have a jagged roll rate, whereby it's reduced by about approximately 20%, and this means we lose the precision in our control surface. But this also applies to the elevator and the rudder, meaning that when you try to get those clean, precise shots on the target, you cannot do so as effectively, meaning that unless your opponent provides a clean shot on target, such as the P47, you may have a little bit of difficulty, unlike our example in this game, and this can mean that you waste a bit of ammunition and miss a pass. We now go into an engagement with Spitfire Mark 5C, who turns very quickly on their landing flaps and does not expect us to come directly for him at the same time. This means we can use our secondary turn, which will be tighter than the Spitfire Mark 5C due to our plane probably having the best turn circle within its battle rating class, in order to ensure that we pick up the winning shots. We see there, however, with a bit of speed, our opponents can turn with us, say the Spitfire Mark 5C in particular, or indeed they do have the ability to manoeuvre with us to an extent. And this again comes around to the concept of the engine performance of the plane. Our control surfaces lock up with increasing speed, and we cannot get to increase speeds as rapidly as the rest of our opposition, whether it be in the dive or in level flight. Our acceleration is decent from, say, a speed of 200 km an hour to 325, and this means that you can build up your speed to the point where you're always in that combat effective position. And I would personally recommend, when you go into an engagement, engaging at a speed of approximately 300 to 400 km an hour. Because by starting the engagement at that speed, you'll find you're in a good position in order to bring all your control surfaces into play, whereby your elevator and your rudder are rather strong, and your roll rate is decent, and this means that you can always get into the fight and do some damage and get the upper hand quite rapidly. As we get in close here behind the B7A2, we take a nasty hit from their rear facing gunner, and we can see already how it has done a significant amount of damage towards the inside of our left wing, and that is where our fuel tank is located. That was most likely an armour-piercing incendiary round from the B7A2's rear gunner, and if that had penetrated through, we could have been a burning wreck already. Shows how fragile the A6M5 Otsu is, and how you have to be very careful when you're engaging enemy bomber aircraft or indeed attackers. As we break away then and pull some distance and go for a reload, we now have to come back to that point that we were just discussing concerning the overall dogfighting capabilities. We've set the speed at which this plane performs best. And as we have said, you can take this plane up to increasing speeds above 500 km an hour, but you have to expect the plane's overall handling characteristics to become a little bit less clean. And this means that in some cases you will not be as precise in your shots, your positioning, and it can lead to your downfall, especially if you end up in a 2 versus 1 engagement where your opponents are both flying at high speed. And this is one of the ways you can beat the A6M5 Otsu, is by forcing it to go to higher speeds and thereby losing its ability to dogfight as effectively. We decide to go after the KI-49 here, who has just knocked out a number of our ground targets, and we're going to see again our hesitance in being hit. Keeping in mind this is a KI-49 variant with a 20mm cannon in the rear. The KI-49 is a rather manoeuvrable aircraft, and we get too close to use our 20mm cannons effectively. As we come around here, we start to score some hits, but only on our machine guns, because we're not providing the right amount of lead. And as the KI-49 uses seesaw motion, we start to take some glancing hits from the 20mm cannon. Another 2 rounds heading very close to our cockpit, and we do not want to get hit, so we bail out of that at the last minute, because eventually we will get killed. But we picked up the assist anyway on the KI-49, meaning that we have done our duty. We go for a reload once again, and the fact that you have 125 rounds per cannon means that you do not have to take reloads as rapidly as you may expect, and this is a nice item to have, especially by comparison with, say, a Spitfire F Mark 9, which only has 120 rounds per gun, which means you do have a couple more rounds to spare. And with the lower fire rate of the 20mm cannons here, this means that sometimes you'll be able to pick up 4 or 5 kills before needing that first reload. Although again, a little bit of precision will go hand in hand with this in order to ensure that you spare your ammo accordingly. As we go for a climb once again, we can see that the game is coming to its conclusion, with the enemy team bleeding tickets, and we begin to level out, contemplating what our next move will be. For now, it's going to be rest, relax, and enjoy the rest of the game, and head towards the stat screens. With our 8 kills and 2 assists providing 46,980 silver lions and 4,208 research points, we must now come on to our concluding comparison of the Otsu against the base A6M5. Whilst the stat cards would lead you to believe that the planes are identical in all but burst mass rating, I personally find that the planes are slightly different, with the Otsu having a slight advantage. This is conferred on the Otsu by its historical nature of having a thicker wing skin, which means that the plane is able to maintain its control surfaces up to a 465 km/h speed threshold, by comparison the threshold being 15 km/h less on the base A6M5. But the effects when the planes hit these speed thresholds are identical, with the roll rate dropping slightly and the control surfaces becoming less precise in general. On top of this, the Otsu is also able to pick up its speed a little bit more quickly in the midst of a dive, although I cannot quantify this as both planes do not lend themselves to energy fighting per se, but more towards base stall fighting and also turn fighting, with the planes having identical turn circles. Indeed, the A6M5 Otsu also has the advantage of an additional ammo capacity. With an additional 25 rounds per cannon, this means that you have the ability to drop one more enemy fighter on average per engagement before having to go for a reload. And the addition of the 13.2mm heavy machine gun rather than the 7.7mm machine gun is a nice to have, with a little bit more firepower and the greater propensity to set your opponents on fire thanks to the armor piercing incendiary rounds of that 13.2mm machine gun, which a 7.7 just does not have. However, other than that, the two planes are very similar and employ very similar tactics or encourage similar tactics to do well, and we can see here by using the same tactics as with the A6M5, we came fourth by comparison to the rest of our team. And to defeat the Otsu, you need to treat it in the same way as with the base A6M5. Use energy tactics, strike it from above, and whittle down its energy state, as eventually, whilst the A6M5 Otsu may be able to evade your fire at first, it will eventually be exposed to your fire and will be brought down very quickly due to its low overall durability. And for those who enjoyed the A6M5, you will clearly, or I hope you will clearly enjoy the A6M5 Otsu, because with this plane, it's all the small things that truly matter. And so I've been TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. Yet until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies!